Hope you can see my screen also.
Yes, Jitendra, I can.
Okay. So guys, welcome to engineering student MuleSoft Meetup 5th. And topic for today's meetup is error handling with a MuleSoft. And Ankita Misra will be the speaker for today's session, and she will walk you through the error handling framework with a MuleSoft. Let me start with a safe harbor statement. Both the speaker and the host are organizing this meetup in the individual capacity only. Here we are not representing any organization or companies. The presentation is completely for the learning purpose, strictly for the learning purpose only. Organizer and the presenter doesn't hold any responsibility. Whatever solution we are presenting here will be work for your business requirement. The presentation is not meant for any promotional activities and the commercial use basically. Okay, housekeeping. The recording of meetup will be uploaded to event page within the 24 hours. You can submit the question at any time. You can just like I have enabled the mic for each and every individual, so they can definitely ask the question directly, or they can also make use of chat window to ask the question. And better, I will suggest better to most of the time you can use the chat window, and also you can ask the question at any time. You need to provide a feedback. So basically we are not getting much feedback. I will just encourage everyone to provide the feedback. You will be receiving the email with a feedback link at the end of the session. You can simply go. It will not take more than 2 minutes. You can simply provide the feedback. This will help us in the improving the future meetups. And we are the four organizer for this particular engineering student meetup group. Myself, Jitendra, we have a Deepesh Dubey, then Nitish Raj, then we have a Ravi Tamada. So Ravi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, no, Jitendra, let's proceed.
Yeah.
Good morning,
So I
everyone.
think Deepesh, you are there. Nitish, no. Okay. So yeah, Ankita, you can start the session from here. So you can share your screen. I will just unshare. So
Sure,
as I mentioned,
Jitendra.
Ankita will be the speaker for today's session. So yeah, you can take the session.
Sure, Jitendra. Thank you so much. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Ankita Mishra, and I'm working in IT industry for last 11 years now. I have an experience in the field of training, testing, and customer support. Currently, I'm working as a manager technical training in Epicero, wherein I'm working as a trainer, plus I do manage all the technical trainings in my organization. And on top of that, I'm MCT and MCPA certified. So I do take trainings for MCT as well as MCPA in my organizations too. So this particular session is basically designed for the people who are new to Mule and who are interested to learn about error handling. How do we handle errors in MuleSoft? So the agenda for today's session would be, we will be talking about the different kinds of errors that we have in Mule. We will learn about how to handle the errors at different levels. Like we have different levels: application level, flow level, and processor level. So there are different ways of handling errors at different levels. We'll talk about that. We will also learn about different scopes of handling the errors, like on error propagate and on error continue. And at the end of the session, we will also learn about error mapping. I would really like to open the forum for everyone, as Jackie mentioned, that please make this session as interactive as you can. And I know there are many experienced people also between us, so I would also like them to incorporate their ideas or their view of, handling an error, or your opinions are quite welcome. So please make this session as interactive as you can. Okay, so let's begin. First, we will be talking about different kinds of errors. Okay, and with every topic, I will include the demonstration because error handling is a very interesting topic of Mule. So we will continue the theoretical part as well as practical part together. In Mule, not only in Mule, basically, first of all, we have to understand what is an error, right? So an error is nothing but it is a deviation from accuracy or correctness. Be it an application, be it a software, be it a basic flow. If you want an output and the output that you are getting does not match the expected output, it means there is an error, right? And error handling is a process to detect the error, report it to the user, and make a recovery strategy to handle that error. so that it should not crash your entire application. It should be handled in a graceful manner, right? Now in Mule, basically we have categorized the errors in high level into two parts. First is system error and second is messaging errors. What are system errors? So system errors, as the name says, right? These are the errors which are thrown at the system level, which involve no mule event, wherein no mule event is involved. What are these kind of errors? These errors are when you get the errors during your application startup. For example, we all know, right, that for any point studio, the basic requirement of Java is Java 8 version. So if you have Java 11 installed on your system or any other version of Java, then what will happen? The moment you will try to run your application, you will get a startup error. That error does not involve any mule event. It has nothing to do with your application, but it has something to do with your system configuration, right? So that kind of errors will be called as system errors. Similarly, when you are trying to connect your application with an external system, for example, in your application, you need to connect your operation with a database, and the database is hosted in any other system. For some reason, let's say the system is down or the database is not responsive, then that kind of error again will be called as a system error. Okay. So these kind of errors are non-configurable, right? We cannot do anything about it. But definitely you will get the error logged in your console. And what can we do for resolving these kind of error? Either you fix your Java version in this application startup case, or you have to fix your database server or your system, right? So the basic thing is you cannot do anything in your application itself. You have to work with the system itself. But there is one thing that you can do. You can execute a reconnection strategy over here. Reconnection strategy will help you to connect your application with the system until the system is not up. Okay. So this is about system errors. Do we have any questions till now? I hope my pace is okay, right? Okay.
Yes,
All
yes.
right. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So let's move on to the messaging errors now. Now, messaging errors are the errors which involves a mule event. Whenever you get an error related to your payload, your attributes, then those kind of errors will be called as messaging errors. And definitely these errors are the errors that can be configured and that can be handled. In this session, we will primarily focus on messaging errors, how to handle the messaging errors. All right. Now let's talk about a very basic and a fundamental rule of error handling. In a flow, if a processor throws an error, the subsequent processors will never be executed, no matter what. Okay? Whether you have an error handler, whether you do not have an error handler, whether you have an error handler at any level, doesn't matter. The first and the fundamental rule that we all have to remember would be that in a flow, if a processor throws an error, the normal flow execution will stop then and there. The subsequent processors will never be executed no matter what. Okay? If there are no error handlers, then Mule default error handler will take care of the error. It will log the error and it will propagate the error to its calling flow, which means the flow which is calling this flow will be intimated about that. All right. And if there are any error handler, then what will happen? The execution will be passed to the error handlers and the processors inside the error handlers will be executed. But the normal flow execution will be stopped then and there. This is our fundamental rule and this is not going to change no matter what. All right. And there is one more thing that we have to be very mindful of. Subflows cannot have their own error handlers. Okay. Subflows are the kind of flows which only act as a container of processors. They cannot have their own error handlers. So please be very mindful of that. Okay. Especially those who are preparing for MCD. In MCD certifications, you might get questions related to this subflows also. Okay. So let's talk more about messaging errors. But before that, we will first talk about errors. Okay. When an error is thrown, sorry, then an error object is created. Okay, you might have observed while debugging your application, automatically an error object is created. Now, this error object has multiple properties, but in the interest of time, we will only focus on two of its prominent properties. One is error.description and second is error.error type. Error.description is of string type. which will just give you a description of the error. What is the error is all about. And error.error type is basically an object. So it has a key value pair, namespace and identifier. Now, namespace basically helps you to identify the origin of the error, from which particular operation of a module you are getting the error. And the identifier will help you to identify that what kind of error we are getting from that particular operation. So if the error is related to HTTP colon unauthorized, as you can see it over here as an example, you can clearly make out that, okay, I'm getting an error related to one of the HTTP operations because this is an HTTP module, right? And what is the kind of error? Error is related to authentication. It means that my HTTP operation, whether it is a listener or a request operation, is not able to connect to my server. That is the reason I'm getting this unauthorized error. Okay, so just with the help of error.error type and error.description, you should be able to understand the type of your error. Clear? Any questions so far, guys? Okay, you can use the chat window also if you want.
As of now, we don't see any questions in our chat window.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. All right.
1 minute. We got one
Huh.
question from
Okay,
Virendra. What is the
so,
difference between error and exception?
okay, anyone wants to answer this question? Anyone, any idea about error and exception? Okay, see, there are not major exceptions to be very frank, Virendra, but you can clearly, I mean, at a high level, we can determine that errors are generally uh, errors mostly occur during runtime. Okay, whenever you run the application and you get some error, then that particular terminology will be categorized as an error when you get it at runtime. But exceptions are can also be received at runtime or can also be received at compilation time also. Okay, so those are also called as exceptions. I think that is the only difference that I know of. If anyone else has any other opinions, please feel free to share. How to handle exceptions? See, Virendra, as we discussed, that exceptions are nothing, but they can be at compile time also. So during compile time, we already know that Anypoint Studio is a very user-friendly tool, right? So whenever you will get any exceptions, you might get, some cross mark in your processor. So that will help you to compile your exceptions basically. At during that time itself, you can design or make your configurations perfect. Okay, Virendra? Yeah. Okay. So the errors can be classified into two more parts, any and critical. Please be careful that we are talking about messaging errors as of now. Okay. So messaging errors can be classified into two parts, any as well as critical. Now, any is the classification wherein all the errors can be handled. They can categorized as general. All these errors can be handled. So we can say that the topmost parent of any general error that can be handled is any. All right. And then there are certain errors which are critical in nature, which we cannot handle, which are overloading, which are fatal errors. Okay. So you will observe that most of the errors, if I'll show you quickly over here, then let me show you. For example, here you have this validation operation, okay, is blank string. So if I take you to this error mapping tab, you can see all the errors which you can see right over here, they all belong to any parent. Okay. Similarly, if I, let's say, for example, if I add one HTTP operation. So here in HTTP operation also, if I show you the kind of errors thrown by HTTP request operation would be this list that you can see right over here, and they all belong to any parent. So most of the errors in Mule which can be handled, they all belong to any parent. Okay, and you can clearly observe it through the error mapping tab. You can have any of the processors in your flow, and if you want to observe that what are the kind of errors which can be thrown by a particular operation, you can check it under error mapping, and you will also observe that since these errors can be handled, they all belong to any parent. Okay, all right. So yes, this is a very important slide. The default behavior of our HTTP listeners, because Generally, we work with REST APIs, right? And in REST API, the invocation generally happens through your HTTP listeners. So by default, your listener has two kinds of responses. One is success response and second is error response. In success response, the default body value would be the value of the payload and the status code would be 200. And whenever there will be an error, automatically the error response would be triggered and the body would be error.description and status code would be 500. Okay, let me show that to you again. So if I take you to the listener, in the listener under responses tab, you can clearly observe there are two kinds of responses, right? So whenever the application is successful, what happens? Your success response is triggered. And by default, as you can see, the body is payload. That is the reason whenever your application runs successfully, at any given time, your client gets the final value of the payload. That is the reason, right? And you always get 200 status code. You can see it is blank. It clearly says that the default value of a success response is 200 status code. Similarly, in the error response, the body would be error.description. Just now we have understood what is error.description and error.error type. So this is error.description and status code will always be 500. Okay. That is the reason by default, no matter what kind of error is there in your flow, in your application, you always get 500 as a status code. However, these values can anytime can be overwritten. You can anytime modify these values. You can override these values. Ankit, this is the default behavior. Okay, this is the default behavior of Mule, but definitely these values can be overridden depending upon the kind of the error that you are handling. If the error is related to, let's say, some client issues are there, then naturally the error status code would not be 500, right? It has to be 4xx status code. So we can modify the value as per our requirement. Okay. All right. Again, from MCD perspective, those are preparing for MCD certification. This is a very critical information because in MuleSoft certification exams, generally the questions you will get, it will be related to the default behavior. So until and unless you are not knowing what is the default behavior of the listeners, it will be difficult for us to answer the questions. Okay. So everything is, at your fingertip. At any given time, if you are confused, just open your listener and you can see the default configuration right over here under responses. Okay. Any questions so far? Any confusions? Okay. So before we talk about handling errors at different levels, let me show you how Mule default error handler behaves. Okay. In the interest of time, I have already, created this application. Let me just delete this request operation. We don't need it. Okay, let me save this. Now, while this application is getting deployed, let me show you how this application is designed. You can see we have a listener. Okay, I have configured it with the default values and the path is test. Now, in the set payload component, I have created a string payload. You can see the message. I have created it in the literal value as a literal value. Now we are validating using this validation operation whether this payload is a string value or not. So you can clearly see is blank string. So what I'm trying to validate, the current value of the payload, right? We all know that this operation is going to fail, correct? Why? Because the payload is not blank. It is a string payload, right? So let's verify this. Right now you can see I do not have any error handler at anywhere. You can see I don't have any kind of error handlers over here. So first let's see how the Mule default error handler comes into the picture and handles this error. My application is already started. I have added a breakpoint. Let me run this flow. Okay, so I'll make a call. You can see the listener is invoked. The set payload component, you can clearly see the payload is created. This is a string payload, right? Now this validation operation has to validate it. The moment it validates it, see, you can see an error. Automatically the error object is created. The description of the error is error.description, which is string, is not blank. You can see error type. Error type is validation, not blank string. So clearly you can see error type, namespace and identifier, right? This is my namespace and this is my identifier. With the help of namespace, we can identify the module which is throwing an error. So this operation belongs to validation module, right? So you can clearly see it over here in the namespace. An identifier helps you to identify that what kind of error is being thrown by this processor. So the error is related to not blank string, right? Now each error has a parent error type. So this validation not blank string has validation validation. Validation validation has mule validation. Furthermore, you can see mule validation has mule any, and after that you should see it is null. So it clearly says that this particular error belongs to any parent, as we have discussed just now. Correct? Now, coming back to the fundamental rule. What was our fundamental rule? That in a flow, if a processor throws an error, no matter what, the subsequent processors will never be executed, right? So what will happen in this situation? Logger is the subsequent processor. So the moment I'll click on next processor, see the execution has stopped. It didn't go to the logger, right? Here you can see in the console, you can clearly see the logs, the error log has been generated. Plus, what should be received by your client? Since there is an error, your error response should be triggered. You can see what was there in the error response. In the error response, the body was error.description and status code was blank, which was 500. So if I take you to the client, your error is string is not blank, which was your error.description, and this is your 500 server error, which is the default value of your status code. Clear? Understood how mule default error handler behaves? Any questions? Okay, all right, great. So no matter what, okay, always remember these fundamental rules. In a flow, any processor if throws an error, the subsequent processors will not be executed of that flow. If there are no error handlers, the control will go to your mule default error handler. And if there is an HTTP listener, automatically the error response will be triggered. Okay, all right. Now, let's see how can we handle the errors at different levels. So in Mule, you can handle the errors at application level, at flow level, as well as for more fine-grained error handling, you can handle the error for specific processors also. All right. For application, see, if you create an application, the application can have n number of XML files, right? It can, and each XML file can have n number of flows, wherein you can have n number of processors to create your application. So to handle the error for the entire application, you can have an application level error handler. And whenever we create this application level error handler, since we want to monitor the entire application, we create the error handlers outside our flows. Okay. Is there any possibility to change status code like 400 to some other status code? See, Virendra, generally we do not play around with the basic law of HTTP status codes, right? We already know that if there is a success response, it has to be 200. Whenever there is an error response, then it has to be, depending upon what kind of error it is, we have to go with that particular error status. Yes, definitely we can change the status code. That's why we discussed that at any given time you can override these values. And to override these values, you need an error handler, right? Because by default, if you go like this, then it will always pick the default values. But either you can hard code the values, or which hard coding is generally not suggested in while creating any application. So you can take help of variables and you can determine the value of your status code depending upon the kind of error. For example, even in success status code also, if the status code is related to post method, it is not 200, it should be 201, right? So we can modify it as per the requirement of our use case. Yes, Amrendra, right. We have to follow a rule set. That is for sure. You have to make sure that if it is to a post method, it has to be 201. Then, of course, you can change it to 201. But yes, you have to take help of error handlers for that. And you need to use variables, to give dynamic values to your status code. But these can be modified. It's not hard and fast rule. It's not a hard and a fast rule. Okay. Okay. So yes, we were talking about application level error handler. So whenever we need to take care of an application, we generally create our application level error handler outside our flows, which is quite understandable, right? Because your entire application needs to be governed over here. So it's not justified to create any error handler inside any flow. Now, the second most important thing is whenever you create an application level error handler, it is always recommended to put the error handler in the global configuration file. Again, which is quite understandable, isn't it? Because whenever you create anything under global properties, automatically under global elements, whatever you create, the scope of these elements will be throughout the application. So naturally, if you are creating an application level error handler, the scope of that particular error handler should be throughout the application. So whenever we create an application level error handler, it is mandatory for us to specify that error handler under global element. Okay, and generally we do it in a separate file. So you already know that whenever we have to encapsulate all the global elements, we create a separate configuration file naming global.xml file, isn't it? We create a global.xml file. Inside our global.xml file, you can create your error handlers. You can find your error handlers under core module. So here you have the error handler, and whatever error handler scope that you want to create, you can add it inside it. We will talk about error handler scopes in a while, but right now we are just trying to understand the framework of how to handle the errors at application level. Okay, so this is how you can create your application level error handler. But once this is created, it is mandatory for you to go to your global element section and define this global error handler under your global configuration. So you need to you need to go to the configuration. Here you can select the default error handler from here. Now this error handler is defined as the default error handler, which means the application level error handler for your entire application. Okay, so this is how we create our application level error handler. All right. Again, from MCD perspective, this is an important part. Yes, Kathy. How advanced can flow error handler be modified just like application level error handler scope if it is configured? We'll talk about it, Kusum. Just give me a moment. Okay. All right. So this is an application level error handler. All right. Any questions related to application level error handler? All right. Similarly, you can handle the error respective to a particular flow also. For that, we have a flow level error handler. Now, whenever you have a flow level error handler, then there are again some fundamental rules that you have to be careful about. Okay, let me show you. Now, this is my test.xml, and you can see you have one flow created over here. Now, if you want to handle the error related to this flow, you have an error handling block already created over here. To handle a flow level error handler, to handle the errors at flow level, you can create a flow level error handler. So don't worry about the scopes, okay? We'll talk about scopes in detail. Just imagine that I want to handle one of the scopes over here. I want to add one of the scopes over here to handle this particular error, okay? Now always remember one thing. Whenever a flow has a flow level error handler, okay, then for that particular flow, your global level error handler will completely be ignored. You do not need to you do not need to worry about what is there in your global level error handler. Okay, please be mindful of that. If a flow has a flow level error handler, then for that particular flow, your application level error handler is completely ignored. Okay, so for example, let's say here I have this on error continue scope and I want to handle the error related to, let's say I want to handle the error related to HTTP colon unauthorized. Just ignore the spelling. So what do I want to do? I want this particular error handler to handle the error related to unauthentication of HTTP. All right. Now, as per the current scenario, you already know that I do not have any issues related to HTTP unauthorized. Then what should happen? Should it go to my application level or should it be handled at the flow level itself? So in this situation, what is our fundamental rule? That if a flow has a flow level error handler, then you do not need to worry about your application level error handler no matter what. Okay. In this situation, what will happen? If the condition is matching, for example, if here I would have given, what was the error related to this? I think validation colon not blank string, right? Something like that was the error. So if the error is related to validation, then you already know that, okay, this particular condition is matching and this particular error handler will take care of this error. But even if the condition is not matching, the control will not go to application level error handler. Rather, your Mule default error handler will take care of this error. Okay, this is a very critical and a fundamental law. You have to remember this particular rule. Okay, if I do not have any error handler at flow level, then we don't need to worry about it. Automatically the control will go to my application level error handler. Your application level error handler will take care of this. But if the flow has any kind of error handler, irrespective of matching condition or not, for that flow, the control will never go to application level error handler. If the condition is matching, very good. Flow level error handler will take care of the error. If the condition is not matching, don't worry. Mule default error handler will take care of the error. But the control will never go to the application level error handler. Okay? Any questions, guys? Any confusions?
Hi Ankita, Annapurna here.
Yeah. Hi.
Let me summarize, just correct my understanding. Now, here in
Mhm.
this case, is blank string. If anything related to validation, if we select that type, and if that
Mhm.
error comes up, then this
Mhm.
particular scope will be executed and it will be handled. But if anything apart from validation, which is not handled over here, at
Mhm.
that time, the execution will go to the application error handler or to the mule default error handler.
No, it will never go to application level error handler, Annapurna. In this situation, when a flow has a flow level error handler, irrespective of matching condition, okay,
Okay,
the control
okay,
of this error will never go to the application level error handler. Okay, in this situation, the control will go to your mule default error handler.
okay.
Make sense? So let's say if I
Yes,
create one more flow over here, okay, let me give you one more example. If I create, let's say, one more flow, again, I'm adding set payload. Okay, I'm just creating a random flow over here. Now this flow does not have an error handler. Okay, and this
yes,
flow does have a flow level error handler. And let's say I fixate the condition as validation. Okay, something related to validation colon something. Okay, just please understand, I'm trying to give the error related to the blank string as per the use case. Okay, now in this situation, what will happen? If the error will be in this flow, automatically the control will go to this error handler because the condition is matching, right? And this particular error handler will resolve this issue. Similarly, in this flow, since we do not have the flow level error handler, if there are any errors in this flow, the control will go to my global level error handler. This part is pretty clear, right?
yes, this is clear.
Yeah.
Now, in the
Now,
above flow,
huh,
apart from validation, suppose HTTP unauthorized has come, and in our
yes,
application flow error handler, we have there handled
yes.
unauthorized, then it should go there, right? Instead of the default one,
No, 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 no. It will
it will
never
not
go to
go.
application. No. Now, in this
Okay.
situation, let's say this particular blank string has failed. Okay, this will fail with the error validation something. Validation,
Hmm.
not blank string. But your flow level error handler is capable of handling the error related to HTTP
Yes.
unauthorized. Then the condition
Okay.
is not
Hmm.
matching.
Yes.
Let's say in global you do have a matching condition.
Hmm. Hmm.
Even then, the control will never go to application level error handler. For this
Okay.
flow, you have to mask your error handler, application level error handler. You don't even have to look at your application level error handler. For this flow, if
Okay.
the condition is matching, the flow level error handler will take care of it. If the condition is not matching, mule default error handler will take care of it. That's it.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the same application, in the other flow, if we do not have a flow level error handler, for this flow, application level error handler will work as good as before.
Okay.
Okay. Clear? All of you clear?
Yes.
Okay, all right, perfect. So the same thing is mentioned over here. Let me rephrase it. So if a flow has an error handler, the error is handled by the first error scope whose condition evaluates to true, right? If the condition is matching, then the error handler at flow level will be able to handle the error. Now, if no scope conditions are true, then the error is handled by your mule default error handler. Okay, not any scope in the application's global default error handler will take care of this particular error. Clear? And if a flow does not have an error handler, then the error will be handled by application's default error handler. Okay. And let's say if in the application level also you do not have a matching condition, then it will go to your mule default error handler. Otherwise, your application level error handler should be good enough to take care of this particular error. Okay. Virendra, yeah. I think first priority goes to global error handling, second flow level, then goes to process level. No, Virendra, I'm so sorry. No. Here you have to take it in a different way. Here, if a flow level has a flow level error handler, then for that flow, you don't even have to worry about application level error handler. The control will never go to application level error handler. Okay, the control will always go to your flow level error handler, else it will go to your mule default error handler. This is the simple fundamental rule. Got it, Virendra? Okay, so don't prioritize it. Okay, that if the global level is there, then it will go to global level, then flow level, then processor level. No, if the flow does not have a flow level error handler, then certainly it will go to application level only. But if a flow has a flow level error handler, then the control will always go to flow level error handler. Otherwise, it should go to your mule default error handler. Okay, yes, Jitendra. So this is a very, very important concept for MCD perspective also. In MCD, they can give you questions related to that. And to confuse you, they might give you one global level error handler also created next to this flow level error handler. So don't be confused with that. Okay, if a flow has a flow level error handler, you just take care of the conditions. If the conditions are matching, good. Don't worry about anything. Flow level will take care of the error. If the condition is not matching, just forget about application level. Directly go to your mule default error handler. That's it. Okay, I hope it is clear now. Virendra, I hope it is clear, right? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So this is one small exception related to flow level error handler, and you have to be very careful about it. Okay. Now let's talk about processor level error handler. Processor level error handlers are created for more fine-grained error handling of elements within a flow. So if inside a flow there are multiple processors for which you want to handle the error in a different way, you can use your processor level error handler. Okay, generally to handle the processor level errors, we use a try scope. Okay, you should be able to find the try scope under scopes in your core module. So you can see yeah, under scopes you have a try scope. So generally whenever you want to handle the error related to one or more than one processors, you can encapsulate those processors inside the try scope, as you can clearly see it right over here. Each triscope has their own error handling block wherein you can handle the errors. Okay, so in case of processor level, any number of processors can be added in the triscope, and any number of error handlers can also be added in the error handling block to handle different kinds of errors at different ways. Okay, now here if you want to let me just clarify. If you get confused, now what will be the precedence over here? Then just try to understand. Take this trioscope as a processor inside a flow. Okay. For example, let's say this blank string has failed. Okay. Then what will happen? The error handler inside the trioscope will first be executed. Okay. Where is my error handler? Let's say I'm putting this error handler over here. Then the control will go to this particular error handler. Okay, and depending upon the scenario, this particular try scope will behave. We will talk about the scopes in the next segment. So depending upon whatever scopes that you have, this particular processor will behave. Now let's say this particular processor is failing again. Then what will happen? The control will go to your flow level error handler, because the entire try scope will be considered as a single processor of your flow. Okay, does it make sense? Now the control will go to your flow level error handler. Now again the same formula. If the condition is matching in the flow level error handler, then the flow level error handler will take care of the error. If the condition is not matching, then mule default error handler will take care of this particular error. And if this flow does not have a flow level error handler, and if this particular try scope has failed, then what will happen? The control will go to my application level error handler. Okay, the concepts are clear. Please confirm. What is processor scope? Does it mean one mule component? Isha, you can treat it as one single component also. It is, see, the try scope is basically used for multiple processes, for multiple reasons. Sometimes whenever the concept of transactions comes into the picture, then also we use try scopes. Okay, so there are multiple purposes of using a try scope. But in case of error handling, generally we use try scope to handle the errors related to specific processors. Okay, and inside these triscope you have the error handling block. So if any processor inside the triscope fails, then the control will go to your processor level error handler, and the processor level error handler will take care of this particular error. Okay, Isha? Yeah. And you can consider this as one single processor also. So if that's why I told you that for some reason, let's say the entire try scope has failed, then the control will go to your flow level error handler. Okay, guys, just give me 1 second. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so is the concept clear, Isha? Yeah. Okay. So these are the three ways. Okay, Puneet. I have a flow with error handling and a flow reference in it. If I got error in the flow reference, then which error handler will handle this flow level or application level? Okay, Puneet, we will talk about error handler scopes in just a few minutes. Is it okay if I answer your questions there? Okay. Suraj, if try scope error handler has on error continue, does controller will always go to next processor after try scope? Yes, Suraj, it will go. And just give me some time. We will talk about scopes, and then I'll be in a better position to answer your question. Okay. All right. So these are the three different levels of handling your errors. Your application level, your flow level, as well as your processor level. Yeah, so sorry guys, I had some disturbance. Okay, so these are the three levels where we can handle our errors: application level, flow level, and processor level. And we have already defined, discussed about the exceptions or the different laws that we have to be mindful of while creating the application level error handler, processor level error handler, and flow level error handler. Okay, any questions related to the levels? Any confusions? Okay, fine. Now let's move on to the most interesting section of error handling, which is error handling scopes. Okay, and while discussing these topics, I think Puneet and Suraj, both your questions will be answered. To handle the errors in Mule, we have two kinds of scopes. One is on error propagate scope, and second is on error continue scope. Now, in case of on error propagate scope, see, the fundamental rule will always remain the same. Okay, we are not going to play around with the law, the fundamental laws, which is the rest of the flow that threw the error will never be executed any further. So if a processor throws an error in a flow, then the subsequent processes will never be executed no matter what. Okay. If we have an error handler, then the control will go to the error handler where all the processors in the error handling scopes will be executed. Okay, just now we have spoke about it, that whenever if there are no error handlers, then the mule default error handler will take care of the error. And if there are any error handlers, then the control will go to your error handling scope. At the end of the scope, in case of on error propagate, the error is thrown up to the next level and handled there, as the name says, propagation. Okay, so whenever there is an error in the flow, then what will happen? If the control will go to your on error propagate, then on error propagate will propagate the error to the calling flow. It will inform the calling flow that look, we are having an error over here. Okay, and in case of on error propagate, your HTTP listener will always return an error response. You already know what an error response is. So in case of HTTP listener, always remember the error response will be triggered. This response will be triggered. Okay. Now let's quickly check this with the help of a demonstration. Let me remove these try scope. Okay. Okay. So we have this on error propagate scope already added. So right now we are talking about scopes, okay? So don't worry whether I'm putting it at application level or flow level. You just have to understand the behavior of the scope first, and then depending upon the requirement, you can put it at your processor level, flow level, or application level, okay? So let's say you have added this on error propagate scope at your flow level. Now here I am setting the type as any. Okay, I don't want any other uh, particular error to be handled. I want this particular uh, error handler to handle all the errors that belongs to any parent. Okay, that belongs to general parent. Now let me show you. If I add a set payload component over here, okay, and let me create a message. This is on error propagate. Okay, let me save this application and let me. Okay, this is already deployed. Let's wait for the deployment. Let me remove this global.xml also, otherwise it might give us an error. Okay, so you can see my application is now started. Okay, let me make a call. The listener is invoked. Okay, the payload is created. You can see it right over here. This is a string payload. Now this validation operation is going to validate. Naturally, this is not a blank string. So what will happen? This operation will throw an error. What is the thumb rule? Thumb rule is that in this flow, the subsequent processes will never be executed, right? And since we have an error handler over here with a matching condition, so the control will go to my error handler. So you can clearly see the control goes to your error handler. Now inside this error handler, we have created a payload, right? And this payload will create a payload message, which would be what? You remember that I have created a payload. This is an on error propagate, right? However, since this is on error propagate, so what will happen? The listener's error response should be triggered, correct? What is there in the error response? Body should be error dot description and status code should be blank as of now, which is 500. So what is the current value of my error dot description? You can clearly see your error dot description is string is not blank, right? So if I click on next, the execution will be stopped and in your at your client end, you should get 500 server error with error dot description as the body. This is the behavior of our on error propagate scope. Okay, so the on error propagate scope will always propagate the error and the response, the HTTP response would be the error response, not the success response. Okay, this is the scenario when you have just one flow. Now let's talk about what if you have a child flow and a parent flow, like I think Puneet, the question that you have asked just now. So let me create one parent flow over here. So if I create one more flow, okay, let me rename this flow as parent flow. Okay, now here I'm going to add a flow reference component to call the corresponding flow. So I can find it in my favorites also, it's easier. In flow reference, I would like to call test flow. Okay, and then I'm having a logger over here. The logger, I'm creating a message. The parent flow is executed. Okay, now here in test flow, we do not need a listener because it's a flow reference component. Okay, now let me show you how it works. Now in the parent flow, you can see I have a listener. I have a flow reference component calling the test flow. So this test flow should be executed. And if it executes successfully, then the control should go back to the parent flow as this is synchronous in nature and the logger should log the final message as the parent flow is executed, right? Let me add one more logger over here. Log the value of A. Helps us to debug the flow better. Okay, so let's see how this on error propagate is gonna behave. Let's wait for the redeployment. Okay, so the application is now started. Again, I'm going to make a call. This time I'm going to make a call to my parent flow, right? So you can see this is my endpoint. I'll make a call. Oh, sorry, I missed to put a breakpoint over here. Let me do one thing. Let me just execute it, okay? Because I want to debug this application to show you how does it work. Okay, let me put a breakpoint. Okay, yeah. So as you can see, the listener is invoked. Okay, the flow reference component should then this validation operation should validate it. Naturally, it will throw an error. The moment it throws an error, what will happen? The control will go to my error handler because we do have an error handler over here, right? So you can see the control goes to my error handler. Error handler, we have a set payload component creating a new payload, which you can clearly see it over here. This is an on error propagate scope. But since this is a non-error propagate scope, what will happen? The error will be propagated to the calling flow, which means that the calling flow will be intimated about the error that has happened inside the child flow. So if I click on next, see the flow reference component has failed. So this operation has failed in the parent flow, which clearly tells that, hey, there is an error in the child flow. Okay, so now what will happen? Since right now we have not have any flow, any error handler to handle this particular error, so what will happen? Mule default error handler will take care of this error. So what will happen? Again, the fundamental rule, the thumb rule, that in a flow, if a processor has failed, the subsequent processor should not be executed. So what will happen? The execution will be completed and the error response of the listener will be triggered. What is there in the error response? 500 as a default status code and error dot description as the body, right? As the final body which the client should get. Okay. Anyone, any confusion about how on error propagate works? Okay, you understood. If you have a single flow and if you have a flow of you have a parent flow and a child flow combination, then how this on error propagate should work? Any questions about that? Are we good? Perfect. This is about on error propagate. Okay. Now let's talk about on error continuous scope. Again, the thumb rules will be same for all the flows, all the no matter what kind of applications that you're working with. In case of on error continue also, what will happen? The rest of the flow that threw the error will not be executed any further, right? Control goes to the error handler where all processors in the error handling scopes will be executed. Again, the control will go to the error handler. At the end of the scope, the event is passed up to the next level as if the flow execution had completed successfully. So in this situation, as the name says, continue. So in this case, if the error is in the child flow, then the parent flow will never be intimated about the error that has occurred inside the child flow. The child flow will say that, hey, you continue, nothing has happened over here. That is why the name is on error continue. Okay. And in this case, in case of on error continue, your HTTP listener will always return the success response. Now, when I say success response, I do not mean the ideal response which is expected. We already know what is the success response. Success response is the default value of our body, which is payload. You can clearly see it over here, which is payload, and status code is 200. So whatever is the current value of payload along with 200 status code, that will be shared with your client. Okay, so let me show you how. Okay, so in this situation, let me add HTTP listener again, so that first I'll show you how it works for a single flow and then we will talk about how it works for a child flow and a parent flow. So here I'll again add the endpoint test, and instead of on error propagate, let me add on error continue. So here I'll add on error continue. I want it to handle all kinds of errors, so I'll set the type as any. See, even if you don't put anything over here, by default it will be able to handle the errors belong to any parent. Okay, all the errors which belong to any parent. Okay, now in on error continue, I'll create a payload followed by a logger. Here I have created a message. this is an on error continue. And what is the log? The log should just, sorry, I had to add it in the payload. This is an on error continue, and in the logger, I'm going to go with the value of payload. Okay. All right. So I'll save this. Okay, Archana, I can see your question. In the previous example, since we didn't have error handler in the main flow and the error was from child flow, won't it go to the global error handler? Yes, Archana, of course. If you have an error handler at a global level, then in this situation, if in this flow, when the error will occur with the flow reference component and you do not have a flow level error handler, the control will be gone to your application level error handler. For this error, application level error handler will take care of the error. So you can handle this error at application level also. So we basically mask the error when we use on error continue. What scenarios need this to happen? We'll talk about it, Isha. Just give me 2 minutes. I think in parallel process we will use this on error continue mode. Okay, let me answer both the questions together. Just give me 1 moment. Let's first understand how this on error continue works. Okay. So in on error continue, you can see I have created a payload, I have created a logger. All right. Now let me just save the application so it should be deployed quickly. Okay, I think it is already deployed. Let me make a call. Okay, I'll make a call to the test flow itself first. First, we'll see how a single flow works. Okay. Okay. The listener is executed, the listener is invoked. Now the set payload component will create a payload for us. This is a string payload. Naturally, this operation should validate it and it will fail. The moment it will fail, what is our thumb rule? The control will never go to the subsequent processor. No matter what, the subsequent processors are never going to be executed. The control of error will go to your error handler, right? Now here you have an on error continue scope. Now inside this on error continue scope, we have a set payload component wherein you will create a new payload. What is the value of this new payload? This is an on error continue scope. Now since this is on error continue scope will always execute the success response of the listener. Now till this particular processor, what is the value of my payload? This is an on error continue. And what is the status code of a success response? 200. So what will happen? If I click on next, see, this time your client will get 200 OK, and this is an on error continue scope, which is the payload value, the current value of payload of your application. Okay, you understood how this on error continue scope works? So in case of on error continue, if there is a single flow, then always remember the success response of the listener will be triggered. And what is the success response? The current value of the payload along with 200 status code. Clear? Okay. All right. Now, what if I have a parent flow as well as a child flow? Okay. So let me delete this test. Even if I'll not delete it, it won't affect. But I don't want to have any confusions right now. So I'm deleting it. Okay. Now let's see what will happen over here. Let's wait for the redeployment. Okay. It's deployed. Now, this time I'm going to make a call to my parent flow. Okay, the listener is invoked. The flow reference should invoke the test flow. The set payload component will create a payload of string type. Now this operation should validate whether this particular payload is string or not. It is a string value. We have a string value over here, so automatically the error object is created. And you can see the current value of payload is, this is a string payload, right? Now, what will happen? As per the fundamental rule, the subsequent processor should not be executed and the control will go to the error handler. So you can see the control has gone to the error handler, wherein a new payload will be created, which is, this is an on error continue. Logger will log the same value in the console. Now this is on error continue, correct? Now, since this is on error continue, it will never propagate the error to the calling flow. It will never intimate the calling flow that, hey, we are having an error over here. It will tell the calling flow to continue as if nothing has happened in the child flow. So what will happen? If you click on the next processor, see, this flow reference component has not failed now, because what have we intimated using the on error continue scope? That nothing has happened in the child flow. You should continue as expected. So that is the reason this logger is executed. Okay, and what is the current value of my payload? This is an on error continue. What should be the status code? 200. Why? Because since this was on error continue, the parent flow is executing as if nothing has happened, so the success response should be triggered. As per the success response, the current value of payload is, this is an on error continue with status code 200. So this is my current output 200. This is an on error continue. Okay, any questions related to the behavior of on error continue? Okay. Now, to answer your question, Isha and Virendra, I think both of you almost asked the similar question, that when do we need to use this on error continue? So generally, whenever you do not want your calling flow to be intimated about the error, in those situations, we can use on error continue. Generally, what happens, see, whenever you create an API, what do we follow? We have an interface and an implementation concept, right? You create an interface layer, then you create an implementation layer. Why you create an interface layer? Because you don't want your implementation to be exposed to the external layers, correct? Now in case of implementation and interface, whenever you have to handle some errors internally related to your application, related to your internal code, there you can use your on error continuous scopes. Why? Because if you will use on error propagate scopes over there, then the errors will be ultimately propagated to your interface flow. And if the error will go to your interface flow, you have to handle those errors at the higher level also. So it's better to use on error continuous scope and handle it internally when you don't want the errors to be propagated to another levels. So in those kind of situations, we generally use on error continuous scopes. Okay. So Isha, is this am I able to answer your question? Yeah. I think in parallel process we will use this on error continuable. Right, Virendra. Of course, in scatter gather also we can use on error continuous scope, because in scatter gather you are calling multiple flows at the same time, right? So when you call multiple flows at the same time, and if any of the flow is not responding correct, and you want to pull out the values of the flows which are giving you the correct responses, there you should use on error continuous scope. Because what will happen, even though there is an error in a flow, you should be able to handle it well, and you should be able to process it with the success responses. Correct. Okay, Uday. For on error propagate, it will take error description. For on error propagate, it will take which is set it in the listener. Right, Uday. So in case of on error propagate, always remember the listener's error response will be triggered. And by default in the error response, the body is set to error dot description. Okay, but definitely at any given time these things can be overridden. So if you want to have some customized error messages, then also you can create it, but by default, yes, error dot description will be invoked. Okay, with that. Okay, within the aggregation strategies, is it related to error handling? If yes, where it comes into the picture, give any use case. Aggregation strategies in the case, Virendra? I didn't get your question, sorry. Anyone, any idea about aggregation strategies? Jitendra, would you like to pour in your thoughts? Okay, if I want to book tickets and internally I have an interface and implementation, what if the error is not shown at the user level, but some error happened internally, and however the end user does not get tickets booked?
Hello, can you hear me?
Ha, yes, Jitendra. Yes, Jitendra, we can hear you now.
Like he might be talking like aggregation strategy. Are you talking about some time-based aggregation or group-based aggregation or size-based aggregation, Virendra? So I think aggregation and these two topics are different, like error handling, right?
Yes, see, error handling, you can handle these errors at any level, be it aggregation level, with respect to your time or your booking your tickets, like Isha, as you mentioned. You just have to identify that how the use case should respond. Okay, whether you want that error to be propagated or not. Depending upon that, you can use your on error continue and propagate. So in scatter gather, I think we use in aggregation strategies to handle without try scope. Okay. Um, I'm really not sure about that, Virendra. See, there is no hard and fast rule, in my opinion, right? That if it is scatter gather, you have to use triscope, or if it is uh, a particular situation, you have to use a flow level or an application level. You have to be mindful of the use case or the requirement. Okay. For example, here the same use case that you can see, I have handled it using a flow level error handler. I can handle the same error using an application level error handler also. Now we have to identify what exactly we would like to do. For example, let me give you one use case. Let's say here I have a listener and there is only one flow reference, right? Handling one flow. What if I have multiple flow reference components handling multiple other APIs or other flows wherein you want to handle your application? Now, in those kind of situation, you would never like to have a flow level error handler in your calling flow. Why? Because if anything will happen, if anything will fail in your in your parent flow, then the entire application will fail. So it's always suggested to use a global level error handler instead of using an error handler at parent flow. But for a particular flow, it is always suggested to use flow level error handler so that you can handle the errors related to these processes in the same flow itself. It does not need to be propagated to your application level or your in or it should not have to be handled in a different way. So honestly, there is no hard and fast rule, to be very precise. Okay, you need to understand the concept, and based on your requirement, based on your use case, you can identify which error handler should be added where. Okay. So, Virendra, is it okay now? Okay. Isha, I think this same question was there, right? I hope the answer is clear. Okay. All right. So, an application level error handler is called only if the lower levels like flow level and application level are not mentioned. I didn't get your question. Application level handler is called only if lower levels. What does this mean? If no, not processor level, only flow level. If the flow level error handler is not there, then the application level error handler will be invoked. What if in this particular flow, I do not have a flow level error handler, but I have one processor level error handler. Let's say I put one try script. Okay, let's say I put this flow reference component inside the try scope. And what if this flow reference component has failed? Then what will happen? The entire try scope will fail. When the entire try scope will fail, it will first check for the flow level. Since we do not have a flow level error handler over here, then the control will go to my application level error handler. If you have a flow level error handler, then no, it will never go to your application level error handler. Then you will have to check if the condition is matching, flow level will take care of it. If the condition is not matching, mule default error handler will take care of it. Make sense, Isha? Okay. All right. All right. So this is about how to handle your errors using different kinds of scopes: on error continue or on error propagate. Okay. So now we are going to talk about just the last segment over here, which is error mapping. It will hardly take 5 more minutes. Okay. So error mapping is generally, it's allowed in Mule 4 to handle the custom errors. Basically, to map your default errors into custom ones. Error mapping is not. It's you can say it's just like renaming your errors. Okay. Why do we need error mapping? Because it will enable us to customize your error handling by routing the errors to the appropriate error handler. Now let me show you why do we need that first. Okay, let's imagine I have two different flows over here. Okay, and in these two flows I have one HTTP request operation in my parent flow and one HTTP request operation in my test flow. Okay, now your application is deployed and it is running, and suddenly in your logs you saw an error related to HTTP unauthentication, unauthorized, or HTTP connectivity. Now, how will you identify that from which request operation are we getting this error from? Are we getting the error from the request operation which is there in the test flow, or whether we are getting the error which is there in the parent flow? Because in error object, what happens, the namespace will always give you the name of the module which is throwing an error, not the name of the operation which is throwing an error. Correct? So how are we going to identify that? Here the concept of error mapping comes into the picture to avoid the confusion. Okay, because naturally every time it is not feasible for us to debug the application when the application is already deployed in production, right? Here you can easily identify that I have triggered this application and this request operation has failed or this request operation has failed. But during production or when your application is already running and deployed, while going through logs, you will never be able to make out that which particular request operation is giving you that error, or you have to do a lot of R&D for that. So to ease the work, you can do error mapping. And error mapping is nothing but you just need to rename your error types. How can you do that? For example, for this request operation, I can go to error mapping. I can click on this plus button, and let's say I want to configure this HTTP connectivity error. So what I can do, I can click on this HTTP connectivity, and here you can give your own namespace and identifiers. Now, while giving namespace and identifiers, you have to be very mindful. You cannot use any other module names over here. Otherwise, the purpose would be defeated, right? So, how to give the namespace then? The namespace should be application centric so that, yeah, sure. There. So, what I'm trying to say is that error mapping comes into the picture when you want to rename your error types. And why do we want to rename our error types? To avoid confusion during runtime. When you are browsing your logs and you want to identify that which particular operation has thrown an error at that particular time, it will help you. The error mapping will help you to identify the source of the error. Okay, so this is the example that we were talking about. So let's say for this HTTP request operation, I want to rename my error type for HTTP connectivity. So here, while renaming it, you have to be mindful that do not use the existing module name as the namespace first, and second, try to give the name related to the context of your application. Because today you are working on this application. What if tomorrow a new developer comes into the picture? He has to troubleshoot the issues. So if you will give corresponding names, the names that gives an idea, then what will happen? The other developer will not have to do a lot of R&D to understand that which particular operation is throwing an error, right? Because it would be related to the context. So for example, let's say this is my parent flow. So namespace I can give parent, okay, and connectivity. So here I can give connectivity. So now you can easily understand that if the error is related to parent connectivity, I can clearly make out that, okay, the HTTP request operation of my parent flow is giving me the error related to connectivity error. Okay, so this is nothing but it is just renaming your error types. And there is one more thing that you have to be careful about, that whenever you give new names to your error types, always remember to change the error type in the error handler as well. For example, here in this request operation, if you want this error handler to handle the error related to HTTP connectivity, so what you can do, you can simply select HTTP connectivity over here. But if you do the renaming or mapping of the error type over here, so if I go to error mapping and if I map this error type as, let's say, test connectivity, then here in the error handler also, you have to make sure that instead of HTTP connectivity, you have selected test connectivity. Then only this error handler will be able to handle your error. Okay. Yes, Jay. After and after error mapping, we need to be mindful while handling as well, right? Yeah, that's what. Because if I now handle correct, same thing we have discussed about it just now, right, Jay? Okay, so this is the concept of our error mapping. Any questions? Any confusions? Okay, so let's rephrase it quickly. So error mapping, MuleSoft now also allows mapping default errors to custom ones. Mapping enables us to customize error handling by routing errors to the appropriate error handler. In each operation of the flow, we can map the possible error types to a custom error type as per the requirement. We just saw that each possible error type can be mapped with a custom error type, right? These custom error types help us to differentiate where an error occurred in the flow. Otherwise, it would be difficult to identify the source of the error in the logs. And it is always advised to define your namespaces related to a particular Mule application name or context, and do not use the existing connector namespaces. Okay, so this is all from error handling side. Any questions? Any confusions? I hope the session was useful. Yeah. Okay. Does it indicate if we map to existing types? Yes, Isha, it will indicate. I think. See, whenever you will do the mapping, it will indicate which error type has been mapped to the custom error types, the names that you have given. See, HTTP connectivity is mapped to test connectivity. You can map multiple errors also. For example, HTTP not acceptable, you can map to again test not acceptable. See, this test and parent, the names that I am giving is, it does not make sense. Generally, we give the names related to the context, right? So you have to be very careful about giving the namespaces and identifier. So accordingly, if you give, let's say, connectivity. I'm just giving a random name. Okay? So you can see HTTP not acceptable is also mapped to this particular error type. Okay. All right. Yeah. Jitendra, is it possible to handle system errors? No, 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 Jay. Um, System errors cannot be handled, right? In the beginning of the session itself, we talked about it, correct? That you cannot handle the system errors because how will you handle it? It does not involve any mule event. It involves a system, correct? Okay. All right. So I think if we have no questions, okay, Virendra, here we can change only namespace, right? No, you can change anything. See, HTTP, okay, I did not show you. So HTTP method not allowed. Let's say I want to change it to test or test method. See, I can change anything. Okay. All right. Okay. So Jess, Jitendra, I think we are running out of time. I'll over to you now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, Jitendra, we can hear you.
Yeah, Ankita, it was a great session. So it was really you have eased the error handling framework and error handling concept. So thanks for the great session and the awesome session. Thank you so much, Ankita. You know,
Thank you,
so
Jitendra.
so guys, like we will keep one more session on error handling where we advanced concept of error handling, where like how we can ensure that the error flowing from system to process and process to experience API. So we will keep one session in something around in like August. We'll keep that session. Okay. So for now, it was a great session. So let me quickly share my screen and we can start with the quiz. So right now today, like we don't have that like what we Kahoot. We will simply have a manual quiz basically. Okay, I will stop the recording.